Welcome to Masterclass here to Mind for All Seasons. I'm really excited to share with you today the Dementia Technique Toolbox. And I'm going to bring up some slides that it can just kind of help frame the conversation a little bit. So if you'll give me a quick second, I'll go ahead and share that. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through kind of an overall framework and a series of experiences that come from my own professional career so that I can illustrate some of these points and help to solidify them a little bit. And we may not go through all of the slides that I have here, just because I want to leave enough time that we can talk and share some ideas and talk about real things that you might be going through right now. So I'll just start by saying that sometimes a close call looks like this. And maybe you've had a close call like that. Other times a close call might look like this. And I've had those kind of close calls before where I stepped on something and the nail went between my toes and I went, ooh, that was a really close call. Let me tell you about a different kind of close call that I had back when I was running a memory care community. This happened in about 2011. And the man that you see in the picture there, Jim, was just a wonderful, really fun, engaging resident of this memory care community that I had the pleasure of serving for several years. He's from Chicago. He loved all things Chicago. He had worked at Popular Mechanics magazine as an accountant. And the photo that you see was taken on a walk that he and I had along the Boise River Greenbelt one day. He normally had this kind of smile. But the day that I want to tell you about, he did not have that kind of smile. In fact, he looked angry. He looked like he was ready to punch somebody in the face. I had been doing a poetry group with our residents in the activity room. And during that poetry group, Jim was out at a doctor's appointment, accompanied by his wife and his oldest daughter. And when I got done with the poetry group, I was bringing residents back to the dining room to get them ready for dinner. And his family had brought Jim back, and he was sitting there in the dining room, and nobody else was around except a staff member that was kind of getting some drinks ready and preparing to set them out on the table. And he looked absolutely furious. And so I walked up to him and I approached, and I kind of leveraged some social background that I knew about him to give proof that I was a long lost friend. I said, Jim, fancy meeting you here. You're still working at Pop Mechanics magazine, which is the way that he referred to it. And he said, no, I retired from that. And I said, oh, well, it's good to see you. And he said, yeah. And I said, you seem upset. And he looked at me and he was just glaring. And he pounded his fist on the table as hard as he could. The silverware was just rattling. The plates made a really loud noise as they shook. And he said, I am. And then he pounded his fist again a few more times. Where's my wife and daughter? Punctuated with a pounding of the fist. And I knew that they had just been there. They had dropped him off. And I knew that Jim's memory was good for just seconds. But something in him was saying, hey, this is not right. And I didn't know exactly what he was perceiving at the time, so I sort of punted and I said, well, they're running an errand. They'll be back soon. So I was trying to be reassuring but vague. And he said, I don't care. They're supposed to be here. And he seemed to escalate. And I thought, ooh, that didn't work very well. Now, in that moment, I tried to quickly think through what I know about Jim's life and what I knew about the situation that he was in. I like to think of interactions with people who are living with dementia as if we're stepping on stage in an improv act. Because if I could wipe your brain clean of everything except the last 5 or 10 seconds and decades earlier, which would be a lot like Jim's brain was working in that time, it would basically be like stepping on stage in an improv act. You'd just be making stuff up as you go. And the way that the stage is set dictates how the action unfolds. And so in this instant, after Jim expressed his increased anger and frustration that his wife and daughter weren't there, I looked around the dining room and I thought, oh, he thinks he's at a restaurant because the dining room in that community looked very much like a restaurant. There were staff members up setting out drinks and getting ready to serve food. So it made sense that he would think he's in a restaurant. And in the same instant, I recognized that earlier in life, when his daughter had become an adult, she got a teaching degree and she still lived at home for a while. And she would go to work, Jim would go to work, his wife would go to work, and they would all converge back at the house right around 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the evening. And usually they were so tired at that point that nobody wanted to cook dinner. And so they'd look at each other and say, well, where are we going? And they'd go out to eat. And I thought, okay, maybe Jim thinks that he's at a restaurant and his wife and daughter are supposed to be there. And to him, it feels like he's been there an hour. If I was to step on stage in an improv act and the director said, okay, Eric, Jim, here's the scene. Jim, you're really mad because you've been waiting for your wife and daughter for an hour and you are hungry, you're getting hangry, and you have no idea where they are and they have not communicated with you. And Eric, you're just a friend that comes up on that situation and you need to help your friend feel a little bit better. What would you do? So again, all this stuff went through my mind in instants. And so I quickly pivoted and I said, man, Jim, how do you like that? You come to a nice place to eat and then your guests don't even show up. And he said, I know, I know. Now, Jim always repeated himself a couple of times, or maybe not always, but most of the time he would say things twice. So he said, I know, I know. And then he looked at me and he said, have a seat, have a seat. So I sat down next to him. And as I was just sitting there empathizing with him, one of the staff members brought out his food and they hadn't taken my order yet. So I just sat there talking to him for about a minute. And then I said, hey, I hope you don't mind, but I got to go use the restroom. I needed a reason to leave. I had work to go finish up in my office before I could go home to my family. And the easiest way to excuse yourself from a restaurant with a friend is to go use the restroom. On my way out, I talked to the staff and I said, you know what? His care plan says that he can have an O'Doul's and some peanuts. That was his favorite snack. He was capable of chewing those nuts safely. So he had basically had fake beer and peanuts as a snack listed on his care plan. And so I told the staff, here's what's going on. And if Jim gets upset again because he looks around and he realizes that his wife and daughter aren't there, I want you to be the apologetic wait staff and just offer a beer and some nuts on the house. Well, I found out the next day that that's exactly what happened. He escalated again. He looked like he was ready to punch somebody. It seemed like it was going to frighten people around him, and the staff came up, and they basically were the apologetic wait staff and gave him the beer and the nuts. They reported that he calmed down. He was very grateful that they recognized his distress and that they would give him something on the house. Ah, what a great restaurant. And he finished his food. And then he went off to his room, and after dinner, he just sat there doing his word find. Now, his habit of decades after dinner was to go sit in his room or in his study at home and read a newspaper or read a book or do a crossword puzzle or a word find. So by the time he got in his room on this particular occasion, he was doing exactly what was normal in his life, and he was not distressed at all. Now, unfortunately, in a lot of professional settings, the minute Jim started pounding the table and being upset, people would have fallen into what I call the task trap. The task trap is what happens when we're too busy, being routine focused, we're avoiding interpersonal responsibility, which adds a little bit of responsibility to us, but we have some responsibility to another person. And when we start putting tasks ahead of the person, then we're sunk. We miss the first step in every human interaction, which is to connect with the person in a meaningful way. And in a lot of settings, if Jim were upset, they'd say, we got to calm him down. And they would jump to the easiest thing, which is, well, we've got some PRN medication, meaning it's as needed. And maybe they'd go to something like Ativan, an anti-anxiety medication. And the reality for Jim would be that by the time the Ativan actually kicked in, he'd be getting to the end of his meal and heading off to his room and sitting there doing his word find and not triggered at all. Now, he might not have even gotten to the end of his meal if they had used that approach, which would then cause people to say, hey, this Ativan's not working, we need another drug, and maybe something else would get thrown on top. And we would end up in a disastrous situation that's not meeting his needs, not actually helping him get the relief that he needs, And it doesn't have to be that way. The way that we avoid all of that is by understanding a few principles which really lead to kind of tactics blending themselves together into strategies. So let me give you an example of how some of these things work together and especially why they're so important. If we go straight to the task, then we're skipping the step of seeing who the person really is and making a meaningful connection with them. If you had a knock at the front door and you went to the front door of your house and you opened it and there was a complete stranger there, can you imagine how off-putting it would be if you said, "May I help you?" And that stranger said, "Yep, just wanted to get a look inside." And they pushed right past you into your house and they started looking around. That'd obviously be a really bad situation. I don't think that you would answer the door, see a complete stranger, and say, "Well, come on in." You would expect the person to introduce themselves, to build trust. And in rare situations, you might get to a level of trust that you would invite the person to come in and stand in your entryway, or maybe come into the living room. I mean, the Kirby salesman comes around hawking vacuums every now and then, and some people actually let them in, or they wouldn't still be doing it all these years after the founding of the company. So it happens. But when it comes to our interpersonal communication, too many people go straight to the task, especially when they're serving someone living with dementia who needs help with a lot of tasks. If you need assistance with bathing and toileting and dressing and meal prep, or you need someone to help you eat, it's very easy to want to just check everything off the list and to go straight to the next task. And if that person doesn't even know who you are and why you're there, and you've not built any rapport with them, I promise you it's not going to go well. So you see on your screen the picture of a woman, and let's just imagine that this is a new woman who's moved into an assisted living facility or a memory care community. And let's suppose that we know all sorts of things that she needs help with because we have a care plan. Maybe she needs a little bit of assistance to get dressed, and she needs reminders that it's time to have her meal, and she needs escorts to get to the activity room. We would go in and we would serve her with all the dignity and love and respect that we could muster, and she would feel absolutely awful. She would feel a complete loss of her identity. She would feel like she was lost in her world and that she was completely disconnected from anything that made sense to her. And she would have a hard time trusting us. Because throughout her life, most people treated her very differently. You see, earlier in life, this is what she looked like. Both photographs are of Doris Day, a Hollywood legend. And if you don't know that you're about to serve Doris Day, it's not that you treat her poorly. You just don't treat her like Doris Day. Now, not everybody's a Hollywood legend. Not everyone is internationally famous, but everybody has a story. Everybody's used to seeing themselves in a certain way. And if we don't respond to others in ways that are consistent with how they see themselves, we get into serious trouble. So let me give you an example of that. Actually, I need to point out the vital 5 pillars first, and then we'll go to the example of a gentleman named Bob. So the vital 5 pillars are 5 principles that good dementia care technique comes from. And I wanted to review them quickly so that you can kind of see how they play into these techniques that I'm sharing with you today. And to give you a quick background on where the Vital 5 even came from, years ago, I was invited to be the keynote speaker at a family caregiver conference. And the meeting planner said, "Eric, we want you to talk about how to deal with really difficult situations. Like, what do you do if you have a husband and wife, and the husband's living with advanced dementia, and he's now routinely coming up to his wife in the home and saying, 'Who are you?' And she says, 'Well, I'm your wife, Martha.' And he says, 'No, you aren't. I know my wife. Get out of my house.' How do you deal with that?" Well, I was teaching an 18-hour workshop course for master's students at Boise State University that largely covered those kinds of tough situations. And I thought, this is right in my wheelhouse. This is great. I'm all in. So I agreed to the speaking gig. And then at the end of the phone call, the meeting planner dropped a bomb in my lap and said, "By the way, you'll have about 25 minutes for your keynote." And I thought my head was going to explode. I didn't know how I could teach anything meaningful in 25 minutes about that level of difficulty in terms of human behavior. But I had already agreed, so I prepared by just dumping out everything I had ever tried or practiced or read about or seen, and I looked for patterns. And I found that basically there were 5 principles that all good dementia care technique came from. So I called them the Vital 5 Pillars, and it was very well received. And I've gone on to share the Vital 5 Pillars in 39 of the 50 states with healthcare professionals and family caregivers. So the word vital is an acronym. And I've already shared with you the T. The T is in the middle of the word vital, and it's absolutely pivotal. It's in the center of everything that we do. And the T reminds us to terminate the task trap. You do that by seeing who the person really is and making a meaningful connection with them before you do anything else. So what about the other 4 letters? Well, V reminds us to validate the other person's emotional experience. Whatever they're going through emotionally, we need to observe it and label it instead of categorizing and judging it. Don't try to talk people off the ledge. Don't say things like, now just calm down when they're upset. We get further by saying, you seem frustrated. And then just listen. Ask thoughtful questions that allow them to express what's going on. That's really helpful to a lot of people. I is a reminder to improvise and be in the moment. And I've already talked about that a little bit, this idea that we're on stage in a perpetual improv act. There's terminate the task trap. A is a reminder to accommodate sensory deficits, because a lot of people living with dementia have major deterioration in their senses. They lose peripheral vision. They lose depth perception. They don't see things that are similar in color when they're right next to each other. They might not process movement fluidly. That's going to cause a lot of disconnects in how we interact with them. They also struggle with language. Many people with dementia can only speak a handful of words. And even if they're speaking better, they might only be able to understand 50 to 70% of the things that we are saying. So if we're speaking too fast, if we're using really complex words, then they're kind of like someone speaking English as a second language. They have a really difficult time making sense of it all. And if you were only catching every other word of what I was saying, that would be deeply problematic. So we can accommodate those kinds of things. We can learn to see the world through their eyes and listen through their ears. L is a reminder that life history is our most important tool because it gives us 2 key things, context and identity. If we're on stage in an improv act, then it's actually life history that allows us to see how they're interpreting the context. We see that illustrated in the story that I told you about Jim. I knew from his life history that he and his wife and daughter used to go to restaurants a lot after work. And so knowing that allowed me to recognize how he was interpreting the present moment. Now, identity is also important. If we know something about who a person is and what they've done and how they're used to being treated, then we behave differently. We interact in ways consistent with how they see themselves. And it was Abraham Lincoln who said tact is the ability to describe others as they see themselves. So we need to be more tactful in these kinds of situations. Now, those are our principles, but what about all these techniques? How do things blend together? Let me give you a few more examples and call out some of the specifics and nuances of techniques. And just to remind you, a lot of these principles are almost like tactics, but tactics blend together into an overall strategy. It's more helpful to use the Vital 5 Pillars in concert with one another as an overall strategic approach than to just think of them in isolation. If I had approached Jim on the day in question, and if I had done a good job of connecting with him by giving social proof that I knew him, Jim, fancy meeting you here. So I used his name. You still working at Pop Mechanics? Well, that's social proof. Oh, I know who you are. He remembers that he worked at Popular Mechanics magazine. Well, that alone is like a single tactic. It's based on the principle that we need to connect first. But had I failed to do everything else, I still wouldn't have solved the problem. I needed to see his identity, as a reflection of his life history. I needed to understand how he was making sense of things. I needed to improvise and be in the moment and step on that stage in that improv act and do something that absolutely made sense in his world. And doing that for Jim was emotionally validating. I also said, well, fancy that. You come to a nice place for dinner and your guests don't even show up. I was mad along with him instead of trying to talk him off the ledge. So you see, these things blend together. Well, let me give you another example. I had a contract several years ago with the Idaho State Veterans Home in Pocatello to go 1 day a month and spend a full day doing different coaching sessions with the staff, meeting, educating them, and then doing some observation, demonstrating things with their residents, or watching some of their team members interacting so that I could coach them through more effective ways of being there with their residents. And 1 month, we were talking about accommodating sensory deficits. And I had pointed out the fact that so many people living with dementia have a hard time understanding what they're hearing. They're not processing language very well, and often they don't speak very well. Well, there was an activity assistant named Erica who was really listening that day. And something that I said caught her attention, and she started really leaning in and thinking about one particular resident. This was a woman who frequently would yell at the staff, shut up, just shut up. And Erica started realizing that every time she approached this woman, it seemed like the woman did not understand Erica. And our natural tendency as humans, when we don't feel understood, is to talk more. But Erica recognized from the training that I was doing that perhaps she needed to speak less. And so on the day in question, after I had done the training, Erica was supposed to be assisting the residents with painting their fingernails and trimming them and filing them. So it was kind of a therapeutic type activity for the ladies. Well, Erica approached this woman who had not let anybody help her with nail care in months. This woman's fingernails were long, they were gross, and any time that Erica had attempted in the past, this woman had just said, shut up, and had brandished her fingernails at her like she was going to claw her eyes out. Erica tried something different. She walked up to the woman, she smiled, she immediately got down below her eye level, which communicates to the other person, you're in charge. And as she smiled and called the woman by name, she held up her own fingernails. Erica had painted her own fingernails in kind of a flashy purple color, and she pointed to them. And the woman sort of nodded approvingly. And then Erica took out a bottle of fingernail polish, and she pointed to the resident's fingers. And much to Erica's surprise, the woman put out her hand, as if to say, sure, have at it. And so Erica got out some fingernail clippers and she started to work with this woman. And every time the woman would kind of forget what was going on and pull back, Erica would just sort of repeat what I've described to you. And she would use a lot more gestures to communicate and hardly any words. Well, long story short, they were able to get through trimming the woman's nails, filing them, putting polish on, putting a clear coat on, the whole 9 yards. And to her great credit, Erica left that experience. She went to shift change with her fellow team members, and she said, I think I just learned something amazing that can help us stop having incident reports filed on this woman on a daily basis. They were doing a whole lot of paperwork tracking this woman's behaviors because she was screaming all the time, anytime they tried to assist her. Erica shared what she had learned and said, I think we need to do a lot less talking and a lot more gesturing with this woman. When I came back a month later, she reported that they hadn't had any incident reports in a month. It had made all the difference in their ability to work with her. Here's what Erica said in her own words about the experience.
Care of this little old lady for just about 4.5 years now. I've really struggled with how to care for her. She was combative and she would swat at me. She would tell me to shut up. She was not responsive to any approaches that I would make with her. I really kind of felt like a failure with her. And then I started going to Eric's training, and it really changed my perspective on how to approach individuals with dementia and Alzheimer's. So I started taking his trainings and trying to apply it to this individual when I would approach her and take those nonverbal cues. And I can't even begin to tell you the changes that it has made in her behaviors, or I should say lack of behaviors, because there isn't behaviors anymore. I can approach her and it's more of a body language, but showing her and approaching her, getting down on her level so she can see eye to eye with me, and showing her things with my hands rather than trying to speak to her verbally where she's not understanding those things. It makes so much difference in her personality and behaviors, just non-existent. I can't even begin to tell you how wonderful it is.
So notice that she was terminating the task trap. She was making a connection with this woman before she did anything else. And what she was doing was very validating to this woman because it met her where she was. But she also had to accommodate her sensory deficits in order to be able to do that. And she had to be in the moment with this woman. She often had to take things one little step at a time and just use nonverbal communication to coach this woman through it. So there was a lot going on that was blending all of these principles together into an overall technique that was unique to this woman and leveraged those key principles that I've shared. Now, let me give you another example so that you can see how these things start to fit together. Many years ago, this was like 10 years ago now, I had a client whose husband was living in a memory care community. And he was younger than a lot of the other residents. He had developed Alzheimer's disease pretty early on, and he was struggling because he recognized the difference. He was the only man in a community of a bunch of 85 to 90-year-old women. And there he was in his late 60s. His wife was in distress, saying, I'm not sure what to do for Bill because he's not getting in the shower. He is refusing to bathe. He smells terrible. It's deeply frustrating to me. I don't even like to go visit him. But he recognizes that he's different than these ladies in this community. And he sometimes wants to leave. And so she was feeling all sorts of guilt. She didn't know how to handle it. And as I sat down with her, I said, let's talk a little bit more about who Bill is and how he sees himself, what his identity is. And she talked about his career as a researcher and how he always viewed himself as very capable. He was an in-charge kind of guy. He was kind, he was personable, and he had some fun hobbies. Like he had an amazing classic rock and roll collection on vinyl that she had moved into as an apartment in this memory care community. He had a curio cabinet with all sorts of little things that were reflective of elements of his career and awards that he had won, things like that. So he was a really interesting guy. And as I was thinking through things, I thought, well, okay, what's going wrong with the showers? Why is he refusing? And I think part of it is that whether his wife tried to assist him or one of the staff members in this facility tried to assist him, they were not interacting with him in a way that communicated, you're capable, you're in charge, you're an independent man. And that is how he saw himself. And so we devised a strategy that spoke more to his identity. And I'll spare you a few of the details for time, but this is what ended up working for him. We coached some of the frontline staff through going into his room and sitting down first and just connecting with him and saying, hey, I heard you were visiting with us for a while. I wanted to come introduce myself. Or they would play the role of a long lost friend. And they'd sit there and they would spot his rock and roll collection of vinyl records. And they'd say, oh, I heard you had an amazing rock and roll collection. Tell me about it. And he would kind of light up and he'd start talking about it. Then they said, I wanted to ask you if you'd help me with something. Well, sure, what is it? I'm doing some research and I wonder if you could help. Well, sure, I'm a researcher. What are you looking into? And they said, well, there are a lot of older women that kind of live in this area. And he remembered that. He acknowledged that. Oh, yeah, yeah. And they said, a lot of their skin is pretty frail. And we're finding that their skin is drying out too much with the body wash that we've been using. So we've worked with a dermatologist to come up with a new formula for some body wash that could also be used as shampoo. And we think that it'll do better and not dry out the skin. But we have to test it first, and we don't want to use it with these older, frail women. We need to get the opinion of someone younger that could actually give us an opinion. Could you help us with this research? It pays $5 every time you test it. And he said, oh, okay. And so they would proceed to get him in the shower, and they would pull out a clipboard with a list of questions, and they would give him the body wash, and then they would ask questions like, does it lather well? Does it smell good? Does it seem to clean without irritation? And he was able to understand those questions and he could respond. And if you ask someone, does it lather well? That is a cue to scrub, but it doesn't feel like a cue. It allows him to feel more in control. It allows him to still preserve his sense of identity that I'm a big, strong, capable man, even though he didn't even remember to scrub, and he hated it if someone said, now don't forget to scrub. So this strategy worked really well for him. They'd tick things off the list, they'd go through all of the research, and then at the end, after he was all dried off and he had his clothes on, they'd give him $5, which he would promptly bring to the facility bingo game. And it was a great thing for him. And then when he wasn't looking, his wife would retrieve the $5 because he didn't remember they had $5 or where he put it. He wasn't hanging on to facts like that. And so they actually recycled the same $5 bill over and over and over, and it worked beautifully. I still remember the Saturday morning when I was out working in my garden and my phone rang and I could see it was this lady. So I picked up, and the first thing that I heard as I said, hello, so and so, she said, it worked. And I said, what? What are you talking about? We tried this strategy for the first time this morning and it worked so well. And it continued working after that. So that's what it looks like when you start blending these things together into techniques that really work, and you have a deeper toolbox to function with. Now, what else could we put in the toolbox? We don't have time today to get into the entire depth of the toolbox because it's basically inexhaustible. If you understand the Vital Five Pillars, you understand principles that can help you figure out a lot of stuff for the individual that you're serving. But there are a bunch more specific things we could discuss, like how to use music, giving reasons to stay a little bit longer, planning for the transition that might come to a person's life, or creating a sense of being needed and having a sense of purpose. So let's walk through some examples of that, and then we'll talk through more of these. And if we have time, we might dig even deeper into the toolbox. So you recognize Jim on the left. The man on the right is Paul. And I had some interesting, instructive musical experiences with both of these men. In Jim's case, as he got older and as his dementia progressed, he started having a hard time running out of energy, and he would become a fall risk. Jim's habit of a lifetime was to just walk and walk and walk. Every day he walked a few miles. He loved walking. And when he was living with dementia in the community I was running, he would do laps around the community. But as he became more frail, he could only do a few laps, and then he'd start to fatigue, and he'd start to lose his balance, and he was at risk of falling. So the staff did everything possible to try to help him get his exercise in and then get engaged in meaningful activity of some sort or sit and rest. But sometimes he would just want to get up constantly after he had already walked a few laps. So the staff would take him to the bathroom. They'd get him a drink. They would make sure that he wasn't hungry. They would try to engage him in various activities. And sometimes none of it was working. And so we decided to leverage something that was very important in his life, music. He loved big band jazz. And I learned through trial and error that it works far better for a lot of people with dementia, and this was certainly true in Jim's case, to use headphones that direct the music right into the person's auditory world as opposed to having music on in the space. So instead of ambient music for Jim, we loaded an MP3 player with his favorite big band jazz. And when he needed to sit and rest and recover, the staff would just put on those headphones and play the music, and he would sit there and just sort of bop his head up and down. And sometimes that would last for 45 or 50 minutes before he would get up again. But by then he had the energy to do another lap or two, and then maybe go to the activity room or come to dinner or whatever else was going on. Music became a powerful strategy for him. Now, Paul, on the other hand, had an entirely different kind of presentation. Shortly after he moved in, Paul started walking around the community saying, and the 1, and the 2, and the 5, and the 4, and the 3, and the 2, and the 1, and the 6. And it was the most annoying thing that you can possibly imagine. Imagine someone at the top of their lungs yelling out those numbers over and over and over. That was so distressing to other residents and to the staff. And we had no clue what was going on. His wife didn't know what was going on. We just knew it was a problem. And we knew it was probably rooted in the past. And as we pulled together the team and did what I call a circle of excellence meeting, where we used people from different disciplines and we went through the vital 5 pillars, and we considered, are we validating his emotional experience? Are we improvising and being in the moment with him? Are we terminating the task trap, or are we somehow falling into it? What are we doing to accommodate his sensory deficits? And what about his life history? It was then that one of my team members, a frontline staff member, said, I think I know why he's doing this. His life history says that early in his career, he worked at potato processing plants over in eastern Idaho, and he became a supervisor. And she said, I'm familiar with what that's like. And in a lot of those plants, they're extremely loud. And when it comes to sorting the potatoes, they grade them with numbers. And they would say, put the 1s over here and the size 5s over there and put the 4s over here. I think he's doing that, she said. Well, that made a lot of sense. And further discussion about that led us to recognize, okay, if that's what he thinks, then what would have been true in his world as a supervisor? And this same staff member pointed out, some of them wore these headphones with internal microphones so that they could talk to other supervisors in the plant and give instructions because it was too loud to be heard over the machinery. And it was also ear protection. And she said, you know those headphones that have a radio transceiver? And I instantly thought of my father, who would go out on his riding lawnmower with these big yellow headphones and his radio receiver, and he would listen to talk radio while he was driving around. And that led to the idea, we can do 2 things for Paul. He was a longtime supporter of the Boise Philharmonic Orchestra. He loved classical music, and so we thought we can either tune the headphones into KBSU, the classical radio station, or we could tune them to talk radio, because he might think that that was just a supervisor talking to him. Well, we put the headphones on the first time we tried it, and instead of him walking around going, and the 1, and the 2, and the 5, and the 6, he just sat there nodding his head up and down, either listening to the music, or if it was talk radio, he would say, uh-huh, oh, yeah, uh-huh. He very rarely would try to grade potatoes out loud with the rest of the residents when he had those headphones on. Now, he multiple times tried to repair the headphones. We went through 3 or 4 sets of headphones, and every time we spent another $75 on that set of headphones, I viewed it as buying ourselves relief. And it was the best $75 that we spent that month because it brought such calm and quiet, and we weren't using medication in Paul's situation. It was so helpful to everybody. So those are some ideas about music. What about another technique? A lot of times people with dementia say, I got to go home. I need to leave. I can't stay here. And there are all sorts of reasons why a person might need to go. Oftentimes we make things harder than they need to be. And so consider this your invitation, if you're around someone with dementia who is saying, I got to go home, to just give yourself a break and don't work so hard. Let's work easier. Because often people jump right to trying to convince someone that, oh, this is where you live. This is your home now. You've lived here for 3 years. Let me take you to your room. None of which makes sense to a person who's living in the past, has no idea where they are, what's going on, and they're just taking their cues from what they see in the moment. Instead, it's far easier to give them a reason to stay just a little bit longer. The picture here is meant to be a reminder that if you're female and you're talking to a man, you can play the damsel in distress card all day long. You can say things like, before you go, could you just help me with one thing? Oh, I promise you, ladies, if you're around a man who wants to go, but you play the damsel in distress card, he's going to stand a little bit taller and he's going to say, well, what do you need help with? And there are all kinds of possibilities for that. Sometimes people will say, I have to go home. And the answer is, well, let's do your hair before you go. Or let's have lunch before you leave. That's so much easier. And because they're living in the moment and they don't remember things very long in a lot of these situations, we can give them something that feels very easy to them, and we can go with that and we can assist them. And then we can pivot to something else and we can shift gears so that they're not thinking about going home. Sometimes we need to recognize that there's a very distinct reason why they have to go home. I remember one lady who would come to the door, the memory care community I used to run, and there were two wings in that community, an east side and a west side. And my office was in between the two. And every day, somewhere around 3 or 4 o'clock, this woman would come to the door from the west wing into the main lobby, and she would just stand there and knock, 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 knock. And she didn't know how long she'd been there. She would knock for as long as you left her standing there. And she was very sweet about it. Well, I would come through a different way. You never want to go through a locked door that somebody is knocking on because you just advertise in that moment, hey, this door actually works. So I would walk up from a different direction. I'd smile and call her by name and say, well, fancy meeting you here. And I'd give some social proof about how I knew her. And I'd say, it looked like you were going somewhere. She said, oh, I am. I have to go home, but this door is broken. I don't know what to do. Now, I came to recognize through trial and error that I have to go home at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon for this woman meant I am tired and I need to find my bed. And so instead of working hard to convince her that she lived there, all I did was say, oh, I'm so sorry. I know right where to go. And I'd hold out my arm. She would take my arm like a gentleman, and we would walk down the hall toward her room. And right before we got to her room, I would pause and recenter her thinking. I'd look at her and say, you look kind of tired. And she would look at me with her droopy eyes and say, I am. I'm so tired. And right then I'd open the door and I'd say, here's your bed. I'll help you lie down. Thank you. And she would just go in and lie down, and she would rest for 30 to 45 minutes and get up pleasant and ready for dinner. So don't make it harder than it needs to be. Now, sometimes when a person moves into a long-term care setting of one sort or another, we also make things harder than they need to be. I remember a lady named Jerry who was living in an independent living community with her husband. She had fairly early stages of dementia. Once she saw me a few times, she remembered that she had seen me. She couldn't remember where she knew me from, but she came to recognize me as maybe a family friend. Her husband had a health condition that required surgery, and he became worried because he knew that she couldn't handle the independent living facility on her own. She needed his help, and he was going to be laid up for a while. So he reached out and he said, Eric, you have a respite program in your community. I said, yeah. And he said, well, I want Jerry to move in there temporarily. I said, no problem. But she remembers enough. We need to come up with a reason for her to be there. And so I would go and visit. I used to teach a music history class in the facility where she was living with her husband. And so every time that I'd go, in anticipation of his surgery, I would spend a little time before or after my music class, and I would get to know them. And I'd spend some time and build trust, and we would talk about the surgery that was going to happen and that she was going to come visit at my place for a little time. And she got to where she kind of remembered that. And so I thought we were golden. The day that she moved in, it was going to be great. Well, her son brought her over. We got her all situated. Her husband went into surgery, and later that day, she was hopping mad. I know I said that I was going to come check this place out, but I didn't agree to stay here. I can't stay right now. I have to go home. I thought, oh, great. What do we do? She could tell you where she lived. She knew the name of the place, and she knew roughly where it was. Now, instead of getting all distressed about that, I just had to improvise a little bit. And I said, I knew her memory was, it would kind of fade after a couple of hours. And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. This is frustrating. I can't get a hold of your son right now. He works for the phone company. They've sent him out on a job and he's not picking up. I don't know how to reach him." She said, "Well, what am I supposed to do?" And I said, "Tell you what, I have to work for a couple more hours, but if I don't hear from him by then, I'll just take you myself." "Oh, you would do that for me?" "Absolutely." Well, about an hour and a half later, she would start to get distressed again. We had her in the activity room in the meantime. And when she started to get distressed, I would go back and I would just rinse and repeat. We'd give it another couple of hours and we'd just kind of kick the ball down the road. Well, after the third time of doing that, this was late enough in the year that it got dark pretty early and it was starting to get dark. And no joke, when I said, "Hey, I'm going to be another couple of hours, but if he's not back by then, I'll just take you after work." She looked at me and she said, "It's getting kind of dark. Isn't there some place that I could stay? Maybe you could take me tomorrow." And I said, "Absolutely. We'll even put your name on the door so that you can recognize it." And I took her to the room that we'd set aside, pointed out that we put her name on the door. She said, "This is great. Are you sure I can stay?" "Absolutely." Well, the next day we had to rinse and repeat that technique over and over, but fewer times than the first day. The third day, it was fewer times. By the end of a week, she wasn't even asking to go again. She had adjusted to the environment and she had learned through experience where she was. Now, last story has to do with meaning and purpose. And this technique is about making sure that people feel that they're important, that they're seen, that they're heard, that they're valued, but it's also recognizing their capacity. In the grainy picture that you see on your screen, on the right, standing as the tallest, biggest guy in the picture, is a man named Dan. Dan was the first man that we moved into the memory care community after I got there. And for the first couple of years that I worked there, we only had female residents. Dan's wife reached out. She was working at Boise State University, and she said, "Eric, we moved to Boise because I needed to get a different job. I needed some flexibility because my husband has early onset Alzheimer's disease." Now, to give you a little background on Dan, he had been a car salesman and he was so good at mental math that he could add up the price of the car with all of the options that you chose, and he could calculate the final price with sales tax off the top of his head. He was also a guy that built rocket cars, and he would take them from California, where he lived, on flatbed trailers over to the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah, and he would race them at like 250 miles an hour. So he had a shop with all kinds of tools. And when I first met Dan and went to their home, I had him take me out to the shop because I wanted to get a sense of how much he remembered things. And I picked up a crescent wrench and sort of played dumb and said, "Now, what's this called?" It's a kind of wrench. I don't remember. And he said, oh, why can't I remember that?" But he was capable of having a conversation, and he was physically very strong and very capable. Well, his wife wanted to move him in, and I was terrified that our entire activity program was built around serving 85-year-old women. And Dan didn't want to do the kinds of things that they would do. And I didn't know how he'd handle it, but I wanted to help out. And as we sat as a team and discussed what Dan needed, our maintenance director, Chandra Turner, said, "Eric, I got it covered. I know what we need to do for Dan. Trust me." Well, I had worked with Chandra for a few years, and she was amazing. She grew up with a dad that was in the home remodeling business, and he took her under his wing and taught her everything that he knew. And she was phenomenal. She also was a licensed med tech. She had a heart of gold, and I learned to trust her. And she said she had it under control. So we moved Dan in a few days later. And every time Chandra had to move chairs or a table or something, guess who was helping? Every time she shampooed the carpet, guess who was holding the electrical cord to make sure that nobody came by and tripped? Every time she was shoveling rock out front, guess who would go out and assist her and then come in the front door, wiping sweat off his brow, saying, "We're working pretty hard here, boss." Guess who eventually wanted to have a name tag because he thought that he worked there? My favorite experience was the day that Chandra had to get on the roof to service the HVAC equipment, and she needed a reason to keep Dan on the ground. And she did one of the most brilliant things I've ever seen. She got an empty lacquer can, filled it with water, got a clean paintbrush, and she approached Dan and played the damsel in distress card and said, "Dan, I don't know what I'm going to do. I am so behind." "Well, what's wrong?" "I'm supposed to get on the roof and fix the HVAC equipment, but I also have to get all the handrails lacquered. Could you help me with the handrails?" "Well, sure. What do I have to do?" And she said, "Well, it's really easy. You just take the lacquer and take this paintbrush and just brush it on the handrails." Dan spent the next 3 hours brushing clean water on the handrails, and Chandra had gone around and told all the team what she was doing. And so people came by and approached Dan, and they'd pat him on the back and say, "Man, you're a good guy to have around. Look at all this work that you've done. Thank you so much." And Dan would stand a little bit taller every time they said that. He got to spend the last couple of years of his life feeling important, feeling useful, being needed, because Chandra ensured that in his life. By the way, that also inspired other people who came in the community, and word got out that we had really good things for men. And before too long, we got to the point that 51% of our residents were male. That's almost unheard of in a memory care community. And it was all because of what Chandra did. Now, I've given you a bunch of different techniques. There's a lot more that I could share with you, but I wanted to illustrate some of these things with stories so that you could start seeing that when you start with the Vital Five Pillars and you begin putting them together in a tactical way, or in a strategic way, rather, that you start unlocking all sorts of possibilities and you're able to have a very, very deep toolbox.